Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome Assembly members and members of the public, both here and watching on webcast, to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main item of business today is a question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. But first, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we begin this discussion. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag Assembly Police. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Item 1, apologies for absence in chair's announcements. Can I now ask our clerk, Jonathan Baker, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting?
Chair, apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Dismal, for whom Assemblymember McCartney is substituting, Assemblymember Duval, for whom Assemblymember Arnold OBE is substituting, and Assemblymember Shlomi MP and Assemblymember Whittle.
Chair, can I just apologise? I have to leave by 12 o'clock. To apologise.
Yeah,
No, I've got to leave early, so I'm so sorry.
Yeah. And there are no announcements from me, so I'll move to agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I also ask members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality which are not reflected in the authority's register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Yep. No interest, fine. Item 3, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meetings of the Police and Crime Committee held on the 9th of January 2020 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Item 4, list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and additional correspondence as listed in the report?
Noted.
Fine. So we now move to our main item of business, which is our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And I would like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Cressida Dick, Commissioner, Metropolitan Police Service, and I think we're having me for the first time, Robin Wilkinson, Chief of Corporate Services at the Metropolitan Police Service. So we are going to start off with a short statement from yourself, Commissioner, about the events that occurred in Streatham on Sunday.
Thank you, Chair.
After which there will be some questions from us.
Thank you.
And sorry, also a statement about the past year, and I think you may want to reflect on the past year and going forward into 2020.
Do both together. Okay, thank you. But if I could start with the horrible events in Streatham on Sunday. As I'm sure everybody knows, at about 2 o'clock on Sunday, 2 people were stabbed in Streatham High Road by a man who was the subject of an operation being run by the Met's Counter-Terrorism Command. That man has now been formally identified, and as again everybody will know, the attacker was a former terrorist prisoner who had been sentenced to 3 years, 4 months in December 2018 and released on the 23rd of January 2020. At about 1:20, this man left an address in the Streatham area on foot, and he was followed by armed surveillance officers. At 2 o'clock, roughly, he was seen entering a shop on Streatham High Road. He's believed there to have stolen a knife and run quickly outside. Within 60 seconds, he had begun attacking people, and within a further 60 seconds, he had been fatally shot by armed police officers. We're confident that this was an isolated incident. It was contained very well by my officers at the time. There is no evidence that this was an attack which was directed or enabled by anyone else at this stage. Of course, our investigation continues. As you know, the national terrorism threat level remains at substantial, which means an attack is likely. Horrifically, 2 people were stabbed, one of whom remains in a serious but stable condition in hospital, and a woman was released from hospital after stab injuries. A further lady, a younger lady, has been discharged from hospital, and she was also injured, it's believed, by glass. My officers provided initial first aid, and of course the LAS, I think, did a remarkably good response as well. My thoughts and those of the Met remain with the victims and their families. It's a really shocking incident for local people and the wider community. We have an extensive investigation going on. Currently now, 75 officers working on that. They've seized several hundred exhibits. There are at least 50 witnesses from whom statements are being taken. And of course, we're trawling hundreds of hours of CCTV footage. We will establish the facts and we will gather evidence to support the coroner. A search warrant was carried out at 2 different addresses over the next 24 hours, and as a result of those, no further arrests were made. You'll be aware that, as in any incident where the police have fired a shot as they do their work, I know there will also be other reviews. There will be a MAPA review. There will be a HMPPS serious, I think, crime review it's called. And of course, people's focus and government focus has moved very much to policy. We will continue to provide appropriate police advice about any suggested changes in policy or law relating to counter-terrorism, sentencing, prisons or probation. I'd like to finish simply by saying that I, every day, recognise the courage and professionalism of all our counter-terrorism officers and indeed the officers who support them on their operations. They constantly face very difficult decisions in demanding situations, often with little time and not enough information. They face a multifaceted and changing set of threats and risks. And I have particular admiration for the professionalism and courage of the officers on the day who responded so well to save lives and to bring safety to the streets as quickly as they could. Thank you.
I think at this stage, perhaps if we could ask you a few questions, and then we come to the second part of your statement, which is about reflections on the past 12 months and looking ahead to the next 12 months. Commissioner, if I can start off. So in your opening statement, you confirmed that the attacker was under police surveillance, was the subject of a police operation, and that he was being followed. I recognize that there's a very early days. I know that you said that there's an extensive investigation going on, and it goes without saying that this committee wholeheartedly recognizes the work that officers have been doing to counter the threat that the capital faces, the courage that they show. But I've got to ask you this question, which is the question being asked out there on the streets. If he was the subject of an intensive police operation, and one newspaper headline, I believe it was the Daily Mail, said he was being followed by up to 20 officers, then how then did he manage to stab 2 people? Was this attack preventable at all? Early days, very early days, accept that. It's not about putting on the spot, but this committee is here to reflect the views of Londoners and what is being said out there.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to, as you would expect, Amish, reveal any further details of sort of normal surveillance tactics or covert tactics in counter-terrorism operations. I'm not going to talk about numbers. We don't talk about costs. But there is going to be obviously an investigation. The IOPC are looking at this, and we are alongside gathering all relevant evidence. So at some stage, the facts, I'm sure, will become very well known in certain respects of what exactly happened on that day, and I don't want to speculate on it. All I would say is, as a general point, surveillance officers are sometimes armed and sometimes not. They are very highly trained. They are armed when it is believed that they may need to defend themselves or indeed potentially others against a particularly high level of threat. And they are conducting, so I'm talking generally here, I'm not talking about that operation, they are conducting covert surveillance. So they are not, of course, providing a man-to-man marking, if I could put it that way. They are there covertly, and that is a deliberate thing. So it is inevitable that there could be a time delay before somebody totally unexpectedly does something which, it's in the nature of their work. They're following people who are doing unexpected things. That's what they never know what's going to happen next, and they're highly flexible, of course. But I think they, in general terms, to be able to respond so fast is an extraordinary achievement. I wish I could assure the public that everybody who poses a risk on the streets could be subject to some sort of thing which would stop them being able to stab anybody ever, but it is clearly not possible.
Sure. Commissioner, was this person the subject of a terrorism prevention and investigation measures or TPM orders as they are known?
We never comment on whether somebody is a subject of a TPIM, and I'm afraid I'm not prepared to either confirm or deny that on this occasion from Mesh.
Commissioner, I understand where you're coming from, and this is not a criticism at all of your force. And although there is press speculation, it is speculation that officers following this man lost sight of him for a little while. But as you said, that's all speculation, and I understand that you can't comment on speculation. No. So moving on to my next question. There's been a lot of debate in the press over the last couple of days about changes in legislation regarding the early release of prisoners, of terrorist offenders. What changes in legislation regarding the release of terrorists do you feel would benefit the safety of Londoners?
Well, there are many conversations going on, of course, and a very important area that we're not here to talk about today, of course, is how we prevent people becoming violent extremists in the first place. How we intervene effectively, and if we think somebody is becoming one, how we get them out of that before they commit a crime. There is then a whole important area of policy if they do commit a crime or show significant terrorist intent and therefore end up in prison, how they are looked after and indeed sort of policed, if you like, in prison, and how they are effectively de-radicalised, which is a very, very challenging thing to do. And we work all the time with people around the world. This is not a straightforward thing to try to do. And then there is the question of sentencing. All these things are questions of policy and for the government and Parliament, and things that we have some advice to give on, but not for us to decide. That said, if there are to be changes to the sentencing regime, then the one thing we would be asking for, I think, is that people should still be released as they are under the current regime on strong conditions, licence conditions. And I think there is a proposal at the moment, for example, to increase the sentence to 2/3, and at that point people would come out under licence. So given what I've just said, that is something we could see how that would work, and clearly for the extra time that somebody is in prison, the public is protected from them. Sadly, we've seen that some terrorist prisoners, pose a threat within prison, both in terms of radicalising and to prison staff. A horrible incident at HMP Whitemore recently, and that's not the only time that's happened. So these are very difficult things. We stand ready to give support and advice to those who have to decide.
If I can move to you, Deputy Mayor, I want to ask you about, we had about the prison service. So Ian Etchison, who's come up with some strong words in the press, in The Guardian yesterday, has been quoted as saying, "I'm unconvinced jails have the aptitude or attitude to manage terrorist offenders." Nazir Afzal, the senior Crown prosecutor, others have, again, made similar comments about rehabilitation programs, cuts in government funding, and so on. Ian Etchison led the independent review into the management of Islamic extremists in jail, has said prisons do not, as I've said earlier, have the aptitude or attitude to manage terrorist offenders. If we are to see longer sentences for terrorists, must reform not also be made to our prison service and the way it approaches de-radicalisation?
Yes, I mean, I'd agree with Ian Aitchison. He's been very strong on the issue of prisons and radicalisation and the importance of what actually happens when people who are dangerous on the streets are taken off the streets. What will happen to them in prison is incredibly important, and how we make sure that if they are to be released, they have been either de-radicalised or rehabilitated. But we know that over, since 2010, the prison service has taken huge cuts, and there are significant problems within the prison service. So there's an issue around, are there enough programmes that we know that work, and then has there been the right investment? And it's not just about what happens in prisons, it's also what happens after, if people are released on licence and conditions. Has the probation service got the sufficient resources to be working with counter-terrorism police to ensure that those conditions are met and ensure that they are supporting those that can be supported to turn away from violence, and they're supporting them in the right way and with the right investment. But I'm clear there will be some people that should just be kept off the streets, and we must make sure that they are kept in custody for as long as possible, and if they do need to be released, they're released under the right circumstances with the right investment and support. I'm really worried and, concerned and frankly quite angry at the state of our public services, which has meant that we've had these attacks in London, where because of difficulties in prison, difficulties with probation, and I'm not in any way criticising individual professionals who are doing the best they can in very, very difficult circumstances.
Okay, I'm conscious that at least two of my colleagues would have come in, so I'll finish on this note. Commissioner, if I can ask you about improved medical treatment for victims of such attacks. So on Sunday, ambulance staff arrived at the scene in Streatham in just 4 minutes, but were prevented from helping victims until the police had confirmed it was safe for them to do so. Yesterday, doctors called for medical staff to be trained to accompany armed officers into such situations to provide faster medical help and save more lives. Are you prepared to work with the ambulance service to enable such an approach? And I do notice that in yesterday's Evening Standard, Dr. Claire Park, who's an air ambulance doctor and advisor to the Met, she's gone on record as saying, basically calling for the whole policy of hot zoning to be reviewed. Lives could be saved. That's not a direct quote from her. But the coroner, Mark Lovecroft, looking at in his report to the 2017 London Bridge attacks, also said that the use of, quote, hot zones placed areas out of bounds to medics was, quote, unflexible and gave rise to a risk of delay to getting medical help to casualties. Simply want to ask, are you prepared to sort of look at how you work with the London Ambulance Service? You talked about your officers providing assistance on Sunday, and you referred to medical assistance, but surely there's a need to review this whole issue of hot zones, warm zones, and cold zones. I mean, one totally understands that police officers quite understandably anxious about the safety of the medics and so on. But there is a balance as well to be drawn.
Mm-hmm. So first thing I would say is that the Met and London have massively improved our response potential, and now sadly demonstrated by the attacks in 2017 and 2019 and now 2020, in the way we respond to a terrorist attack of all sorts, and not least our ability to ensure that with effective command and control people are kept as safe as possible, but that we do have the best possible, I think, in the current circumstances, medical model. Now, this means, for example, the firearms officers are very highly trained in emergency life-saving. All my officers are regarded by HEMS as the finest in the world at giving immediate first aid. They are absolutely superb at doing that. We have a very fast response in terms of our explosives people. So somebody, as in these circumstances, who is wearing what turns out to be a mock vest, but nevertheless could have been a fully enabled IED, poses a huge risk to anybody going near. So we have to be very controlled about who might go near. And I absolutely understand what the coroner said, and yes, we have been reviewing that, and yes, I have been discussing personally with HEMS whether a model in which a few of their people were trained to go in with our specialist firearms officers in certain types of scenarios, whether that might be a good model. I have to say I'm not a medical person, and there are some people who don't think that's the right way to go, but there is a review going on as a result of the London Bridge inquest. This might be a good thing to do. It will be different, it will be very expensive, and of course there'll only be a limited number of them, and I don't think it would have made, frankly, in my view, it wouldn't have made the slightest bit of difference on this Sunday, because in fact it would be extremely unlikely that those people would have got there faster than we allowed the LAS into the scene. But one can imagine scenarios in which you do have hot zone or warm zone where you want to bring suitably trained medical professionals in, I can imagine that that's why it's being reviewed. But I don't want people to think that where we are, you know, is anything other than very, very professional and much better than it would have been even a couple of years ago, and certainly 4 or 5 years ago. And I pay tribute to the people, including my predecessor, Mark Rowley, and others, who fought and fought for investment in our ability to respond collectively across London to marauding terrorist attacks and exactly this sort of threat which was anticipated.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I think this committee does recognise that. So can I move on to Assemblymember Susan Hall and then Assemblymember
a couple
Joanna,
of things. First of all, Commissioner, I completely agree with you. I have nothing but admiration and gratitude for these brave officers. To actually, however much you're trained, to shoot somebody is a very brave thing to do, and they should be recognised for that. On that, the thing I'm worried about that is the IOPC. They take, I have been told, they take a month of Sundays to investigate these things. The officer is off duty while he's being, or she is being investigated. Is that correct?
So we have a very clear and I think well-worked policy for what we call post-incident management and post-incident investigation for the people we call the key police witnesses. And I should stress these are witnesses at this stage, and I certainly hope that's how they remain. That will be a matter for the IOPC, of course. Our experience with the terrible events at Fishmongers Hall and indeed in 2017 is that in terrorist cases where a terrorist has been shot, actually the IOPC have been working very well with the Met investigators and very fast. And I think, and you'd be very welcome if you were to meet our firearms officers. As a generality, it is, as you say, an appalling thing to do. Yes, they are trained. It happens extraordinarily rarely in London. I think only 3 times last year were shots fired by those thousands of firearms officers across the whole of London. Certain roles, it's extraordinarily unexpected that you might be asked to do that. Surveillance being one. You know, you're not drawing your weapon hardly ever. And so we will do our level best to ensure they feel properly supported. There is an independent investigation, and I am confident that the IOPC will get on with this fast. The officers are not suspended from duty in terms of any kind of, in terms of the IOPC investigation is probably the best way of putting it. However, in the early days after a police shooting, for welfare reasons, whilst they're going through a number of different processes, including getting their evidence given and that kind of thing, we don't ask them to go on the streets.
Good. Well, I'm glad they're being looked after, and I have spent a shift with them. They're incredible officers. How much is it costing the Met to monitor suspected terrorists in London?
Goodness me, that isn't
Perhaps you can come
a
back
good
to
but
us.
really difficult question, Susan. I'm afraid I just couldn't put a figure on it at the moment.
Okay.
But we, in a sense, our job is always to see there's a whole series of risky people. You know, there are about 3,000 subjects of interest.
Yes.
Our job is to work out who poses the most risk at any one time, some of whom will be ex-prisoners, and some of whom, you know, will come from overseas, radicalised in their bedroom, all these different ways, and they will be at various different stages of posing threat. And we have to work out who poses the most threat. But you could say, in a way, that is our job, monitoring them. And I can't tell you how much of that is given at any one time to people who have recently or in the last couple of years come out of prison.
Fair enough. I was wondering whether it had gone up by quite a percentage in recent years, purely because we do look at your budget, and obviously people have to understand that this must be a
Sure. So the terrorist budget, counter-terrorist budget obviously has gone up. The work has gone up a very great deal. The teams are still busier than they were in 2016 or early 2017. The tempo is very high, and that does include work in relation to people who have been released from prison and are on licence.
How many convicted terrorists that have been released actually live in London?
I can't tell you that. I will try to write to you about that. However, there is a caveat here, which is that very often people will not be released for obvious reasons to where they came back to where they came from.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll leave it at that.
I just echo the sentiments around the bravery of your officers. I think it's quite clear that if they were not in the vicinity, that the situation would have been that much worse. But I was very pleased that you talked about the need not to just look at legislation, but to look at causes. It's a conversation with regards to the probation, the prison service. And do you get the sense that the government is now wanting to do that root and branch review? We do know there is an independent review of Prevent ongoing. The Mayor has produced a report about what he would like to see in London with regards to additional resources and powers for the city with regards to that.
Yeah.
So I wondered, do you or the Deputy Mayor believe that that is a conversation the government is now wanting to have?
I think, I mean, if Neil and I would both say we welcome the Prevent review. Neil is on record in relation to that. Preventing people in the first place is the most important part of the strategy, isn't it? It's also, I think, the hardest. And we need to put lots and lots of effort into it. We are constantly having conversations with the government about various aspects of preventing people or de-radicalising people. And I think there is a big effort going on to ensure that we really do understand the best intervention points and the challenges in different environments, including in prison.
Good. And the government, or the Home Secretary, has talked about bringing forward some emergency legislation. Obviously, whilst you've talked about the need for extra conditions and very strict conditions of people you deem at risk, or to be a risk to the public, once they are released, to have conditions applied to them, that obviously has to be in quite a robust legal framework with judicial oversight to that. Is that conversations that has started to take place, perhaps with the Deputy Mayor for Policing as well?
If I just go back to what you're saying about Prevent in terms of the importance of prevention. I mean, the Mayor the Mayor published the County Violent Extremism Programme report last year, which had a number of recommendations. It was a really in-depth look at what Londoners and what communities felt about, not just about the Prevent programme, but how best to protect and support families and individuals and communities so that they can support their young people and anybody within their community so they don't get radicalised. My concern about government at the moment is that it feels very siloed. It looks at sentencing as a response to the threats and risks that we're seeing on the streets of London at the moment. But it is not also looking in depth enough around the causes and the drivers, around what it means around social cohesion and community. We can see that there's the Prevent review, but they're not really taking up any recommendations at the moment around communities, strengthening communities, improving social cohesion, and we know that those are incredibly important, as well as the other things, but real bedrock of strong communities and strong families as well. And I can't see that conversation being really joined up in government, and that's what we are lobbying for at the moment, is to join those conversations up and not just to look at sentencing. Sentencing is important in terms of taking risky people off the streets, but making sure that there is that not just a conversation, but there's a real drive to say, okay, then what do we need to invest in? And it does come back to a real, holistic approach around youth services, schools, education, community support, and we're not seeing that at the moment, and that does really worry me.
Okay. I don't know if you want to comment about, but you're feeding into that discussion about extra powers.
Absolutely, we are. Yes, we are.
Fine, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Commissioner, going back to the original intention, but we had asked you to make an opening statement. Your reflections on the last 12 months, how you see the force going forward over the next 12 months, and also bearing in mind this is the last time you'll be appearing before this committee as it is presently constituted. So we talked about enough. We talked about the terrorist threat, about Stratham, and understandably had to give members time. But I will still ask you to go back to the statement as we originally envisaged you making, and tell us of your plans.
Thank you, Chair, and I should have started by saying to those members who are not going to be here in the future, thank you for the support and work we've done together is probably the best way to put it. And I look back on 2019 with, as you would expect, great pride for my people. I think there were some brilliant achievements and some wonderful moments, not least the celebration of 100 years of women in policing, some great policing operations. The NATO conference passed without anybody almost noticing it, a huge and complicated thing. The visit of the President of the United States, 75th anniversary of D-Day, the Cricket World Cup, a general election where there was very heightened fears about candidate and other security, 2 openings of Parliament, the safest Notting Hill Carnival I've ever seen, I think, and some extraordinary cases brought, to successful conclusion. Countless murderers, sex offenders, terrorists, yes, prolific offenders, gang members. Some really complicated cases that the Met took on and dealt with very well. And I've only, skated the surface of what the teams have been doing. We've, quietly in the background, we've improved an awful lot of our working, and I pay tribute to Robin for much of that. So some really vital areas of compliance, for example, in terms of subject access and freedom of information, in terms of the engine of the Met, bringing in so many new people, recruiting, vetting. I could go on, but these are vital parts of the overall strategy to improve the strength of the Met. It's been recognised by the HMI with good reports, and we've won lots of national awards. And I sense, I don't take this for granted at all, but I think the public understand their police people quite well in many respects and are very grateful for what they're doing. However, violence, of course, has been not only in the headlines, but in my mind, every day. We've had a national rising trend in violence, and we'll come back to this in more detail, I'm sure, but London has not been very different. And in particular, we ended the year, as you know, with a 10-year high in homicides, which is really horrible and tragic. We've made some real, inroads in certain areas of violence. We'll talk about this later, but in moped crime, in acid attacks, in the most important one for me, in a way, after homicide, the violence with a knife injury victims under 25, significant reductions in lethal barrel discharges, reduction in violence with injury generally, and in those sort of bucking the national trend in some respects. But a very challenging year for London and the Met in relation to violence overall. And we've been very stretched at times, not least because of Extinction Rebellion in April and October, and an increased requirement to either respond to violent incidents or respond to extra events, protests related to exit from the European Union, putting nearly 60 people a day around Parliament and the environs for the best part of 12 months. So, I was sort of operationally, I say we've done some brilliant things, but we've had too many homicides, we've had too many street robberies, too many violent attacks, particularly those involving our young people. And in common with other police services across the country, we have brought fewer offenders to justice overall, particularly in some categories, than I would like, and we will talk about that. And the efforts we are making to improve, together with the prosecution service, how well we do on that. Again, looking at the sort of back area, if you like, but really important, we have continued to equip our officers better and better. When I became Commissioner, I said I wanted them to feel as well led, as well equipped, as well as supported, and as reasonably safe as they could. And officers and staff have been in receipt of extra, better equipment, particularly technological equipment, and also, crucially, our Operation Hampshire, which is what we do when somebody is assaulted, has been invested in and much improved this year. So we are bringing more people who assault our officers to court. We're providing much better health support to them in a variety of different ways, and actually more widely across the Met, much better health support. And that is reflected, I see, in our staff surveys, in a positivity and an improvement in how people are feeling, but of course much further to go. Pause on 2019. The growth has started, and we're really, really grateful for that, because it will help across pretty much everything I've talked about. In 2020, we are already focusing even more on violence. We are revamping some of our approaches, more partnership work, more community involvement, more prevention work, and most importantly, better and more enforcement work. We're working with the government to see whether some laws, which we regard as currently inhibiting officers unnecessarily or are just outdated, could be improved. And we look forward to some major events again this year, Euro 2020 and Notting Hill and so forth. There's quite a lot coming our way again. If I turn to growth, I think clearly the major focus for us, our number one priority continues to be violence operationally. And then secondly, the big thing for the Met in 2020 is growing at the pace that we're growing at. So 350 to 450 officers every month coming through Hendon. And that is an amazing achievement, I think, for those who attract, recruit, and bring in and help learn and develop those officers. And I'm very confident about the pipeline. That means we'll get to 31,500 by April. We will get to 32,300 by early autumn. And as a result of the recent announcement about the precept, we will get to 33,000 by April 2021. So that's it's a huge operation to bring enough people in to replace those who are leaving and then bring in extras and to be growing at that pace. Those officers will go into violence work and onto the front line. But it's not just about violence and growth. We continue to change. There's a huge amount happening on our estates this year, which we may want to talk about later. And we will continue to roll out better equipment for our people to make them less friction in their work, able to work better on the streets, more safely on the streets, more efficiently, more effectively. And a lot of that, again, is technological. New radios, a search and review system that will aid us with dealing with digital data will come in the autumn that we've developed. That will help with disclosure. We've got new tablets being rolled out, finished by May. The officers are loving those. Some major technology programs, as you know, and much better use of data in support of them for now and into the future.
Thank you, Commissioner. There's a lot there. And I think we all recognise the budgetary pressures that you work under and have been for quite some time. And certainly the good news is 33,000 officers of the streets of London by April 2021. So I think that's certainly something to cheer us all up. Any questions? We've got a number of sections coming up on violent crime amongst other issues, but any specific questions arising from the Commissioner's statement? If not, I'll move straight to the first set of questions, which is on violent crime, to be led by Assembly Member O'Connor.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And I'd also like to add my thanks particularly to you, Cressida. It's my last opportunity, I think, to do so, but also through you to your officers for the year, and also supporting the comments around supporting the officers involved at the weekend. So, turning to violent crime, indeed you've just reaffirmed that it is the number one issue facing the Metropolitan Police and Londoners across the city. My first comments really, we've heard you talk about extra officers coming 350 a month, etc. But could you please reflect upon the fact that homicides at the highest since 2008, and I've been around long enough to remember 2008, that's a particularly horrific year. And last year it was 146 compared to 154 then. Knife crime, we can share statistics, some are going up, some are going down, but violence in London continues to be at the highest level and an unacceptable level. Would you like to again comment and reaffirm what your priorities and how you want to reduce that?
Thank you. Yes, so we absolutely agree it's the number one priority. And as I said, I think we have shown over the last couple of years some significant inroads into some very important categories of violent crime. I won't repeat the statistics, but I am pleased with what has been achieved there. However, of course, that level of homicide is just too high. Each one is a tragedy, and it is horrible that it went up last year. So what are we doing about it? Well, first of all, I've moved a further 100 officers who are experienced, very skilled officers, away from other bits of work into dedicated work alongside the Violent Crime Task Force in early January. They will be helping the Violent Crime Task Force in their work to bring people to justice, particularly the very high harm offenders, people who are perhaps already on bail for something and an investigation just needs to be speeded up. But getting people brought to justice, targeting the most dangerous individuals. Secondly, we will be bringing more focus on the horrible crime of robbery. It has lots of manifestations from, really a high proportion of it, of course, is young person on young person. Some of it is what you might just call, really horrible, exaggerated bullying. And at the other end, you have, vile crimes in which very rarely, but occasionally people get stabbed. A large proportion of robbery does involve either the suggestion, the intimation, or the actuality of knife crime. So I'm convinced that by putting extra effort into reducing robbery, which has gone up far too much in the last few years, we will have another impact on knife crime. We'll be putting away in prison more violent offenders. We're carrying on with our big effort against street drug dealing and the people who are doing that who are also violent offenders. And we will, as I said, be putting more and more people onto the BCUs, into local areas, into the hotspots in particular. So it's about people, it's about places, of course it's about events, it's about improved intelligence and better coordination and tasking, even more focus, particularly in some crime type areas like robbery, and I am absolutely certain that we will continue to bear down in an effective way. You'll want to ask me about things beyond enforcement, I'm sure, and so don't get the impression that's the only thing we're interested in, but actually that's our main job.
Okay, all right. I'll be discussing with you Safe Enabled Team's role in that in a later set of questions. You mentioned the Violent Crime Task Force, which I think many colleagues here have been out with on patrol. Can I ask a question around that? You're saying you're adding another 100 officers to add to that team. That by nature, you can comment on this, that by nature will be abstractions, but you can mention that. Violent Crime Task Force, is that now mainstreamed within your budget? Because before they were coming from different parts of the organisation. That's the question. Is that mainstream in your budget as a group?
Yes, so the posts are mainstreamed, yes they are. And we're completely confident about the budget going forward, if that's the subtext of that. Yes, we have brought people from other areas to boost in the new year.
Yeah.
However, as the new officers come into the Met, they will be able to allow people eventually to be released back into the skill areas that those colleagues came from, if that makes sense. So the full-time effort on violent crime is growing again. That's the way to put it. But equally, every single officer and member of staff knows that violence is my number one priority. Yeah. And there are a whole range of teams beyond the Violent Crime Task Force, the DOGS officers, the firearms officers, the surveillance officers, who spend an enormous proportion of their time and will be spending even more of it in the future tackling violence. Yeah, I
mean, the subject of this morning is mainly the enforcement side, because in a couple of weeks we've got a meeting with the Mayor and the Director around the VRU, and that will be explored very fully in that particular session. So my question now is really around the enforcement aspect of it. So, of course, one of the tools you have is stop and search, which has been, again, the dialogue around that has been well rehearsed. It's building over many years. And for the record, I think all of us, or most of us around this table, very much support that as a tool, particularly with the advent of the body-worn camera. That's changed the whole narrative of stop and search. However, it has been reported in various papers or elsewhere that stop and search has, even though it's increased, and you've supported that increase, it's not necessarily been effective in reducing violent crime in London. Would you want to comment on that suggestion?
Yes, I would. Well, first of all, I do support, as you well know, the tactic very much, and we have seen the use of the tactic very much. I've seen a big increase in the last couple of years in the amount of stop and search. So for the whole of the last calendar year, I think there were about 195,000 stop and searches, which is a 30% increase. And the year before was a large increase on the year before that. People often talk about Section 60, and we've seen a large increase in the number of authorities for Section 60, but it still remains a small proportion of overall stop and search, Section 60 being the one where you don't need reasonable grounds, but we use after a violent incident where we think there's going to be reprisals, or when we have intelligence that two gangs are going to meet and fight, or perhaps occasionally football supporters or that sort of thing. But it remains, you know, we've done 8,500 just over Section 60s in the year. So it's still a small proportion, about 5%, I think that is, of the total. And we know that, you know, Londoners in general say we should use stop and search, and that it is strongly supported by many, many people, not least, you know, the parents of people who've been killed as a result of knife crime or gun crime. As for its effectiveness, as a professional, I have to tell you, I am certain it is having an effect. Good. And as you say, body-worn assists in terms of people's understanding of what is happening and the ability to scrutinise and accountability and to give evidence in the future. Complaints are very, very low. But as a result of stop and search, just one way of thinking about it is in terms of detection. So last year, we had over 4,000 arrests for weapons alone, and of course we seized a very large number of horrible, horrible weapons. But in terms of wider, you know, effect, I am absolutely certain that it does have a good effect. It suppresses violence when it might be about to happen. It ensures that those who are, you know, repeatedly going about the streets either intent on violence or carrying a knife know that there is, you know, likely to be police out there who are likely, if they recognise them and have the grounds to do it, to stop and search them, so it deters people from carrying them. And I think that when you look at, I know you probably put to me the academic research, it's very limited. Some of it, frankly, I would never have expected it to show the effect that I know this is having in certain places. So I'm not suggesting for 1 second there needs to be limitless academic research. What I'm suggesting is we need to be using it. We need to be using it professionally, which I think we are, in an accountable manner, which we are. We need to be doing it with as much as possible confidence from Londoners, and that includes young people and those who currently have less confidence, and we need to do more to help them have confidence in it. But I absolutely expect my officers to carry on using this at, you know, much higher levels than 4 or 5 years ago in 2020, because we have a big problem with street violence in London.
I'll pause you there, because I think we often slip into the danger of almost trying to over-justify the use of a very effective tool that is recognised by Londoners. And I know Jeanette's got a couple of questions around the community, but from my experience when I've been out in the community, some years ago there was an antagonism, and Jeanette will speak to this later probably, but I felt particularly with the families that have lost young men and women in the communities, and with the change of body-worn armour, there's more of an acceptance of that. One question I wanted to, just a bit of clarification, is often the main reason for stop and search is drugs, and I can kind of understand that, and with weapons, points and blades second. I think that's obvious, and I'd like you to confirm that, because when officers are out on the street, and particularly on Section 60s, it's often drugs is the driver for the searches. Could you just clarify that kind of disparity of figures and how that kind of works?
We sadly do know, and this is an area that academic research and government documents and City Hall documents absolutely confirm, that a huge amount of our homicides, our knife injuries under 25, our stabbings in general, are related to either gangs or drugs and drug dealing, a massive amount. And when you look at our victims and our offenders of the most serious crimes, a very high proportion of them have been involved in drug dealing. We have lots of worries from our public about drug dealing, knowing that areas where overt drug dealing is taking place are areas that are hotspots for violence. So we have been increasing the number of patrols to try to disrupt those markets. And when officers are patrolling and they see a known drug dealer and they see them behaving in a particular type of way, they are likely to stop them. And quite often they will search them if they have the grounds, and if they do search them, they very often, not always, will find drugs. And then, of course, if that's a large amount, that's a possession with intent to supply, that's a serious offence. We try to bring them to court, and we're doing that more and more and more. You know, we do searches at their home addresses and all that kind of thing. Normally find weapons, often find drugs, and if we may well find weapons on the street. So it's something that is thought through. But I was out with the Violent Crime Task Force the other night. I go out with them quite often, and I do understand that some young people who are stopped with a small amount, as they see it, of cannabis, are a bit baffled. I've seen this. They think, well, this isn't a serious thing. What are you worried about? And actually, of course, for us, it is not something where we're going to lock them up unless this is a repeat offence. We're going to do a community resolution. But we've got a challenge here that some young people just regard this as a perfectly lawful thing. It's not lawful. And we won't be trying to stop people in possession routinely all the time, because our focus is on violence. But we'll be in the drugs markets, and we'll be stopping and searching people where there's grounds. So we'll come across drugs.
Okay. My last question before I think Jeanette comes in is about, you touched on Section 60.
Yeah.
I think we'll all agree that we've seen a rapid increase in Section 60s. In my inbox is after the tragic event in Croydon a couple of weeks ago, Section 60. It seems to almost to be a natural case, and I don't mention that in a critical manner, but Section 60s are there and are used for a purpose. Are you comfortable with the use and the relatively prevalent use of Section 60 at the moment?
I am comfortable. I absolutely am. We do have good training for the people who do the authorities. We have good record keeping. We have very good scrutiny and accountability of it. And in fact, the Deputy Mayor was taken through that recently, and I think agrees that there's a really tight grip by the Met on making sure we know what is going on in stop search and in terms of Section 60s. Actually, it's not an automatic thing. It's not unusual for me to get a phone call to say, why haven't you put a Section 60 in? And I will say, because the intelligence doesn't justify it, the officer has not thought it is appropriate. They're quite rigorous about when it is appropriate, when it's not. They have to be. They've got their name at the bottom of the sheet. And so it isn't just a knee-jerk at all.
Of
But I think it has been highly effective. And again, I've been out many times myself when they've said there's a Section 60 here. I've said, remind me why. They tell me, and just the other night, for example, we were going somewhere, they said that we have good intelligence that this gang's going to fight with that gang there. We've got a Section 60.
The decision is signed off. You've mentioned the signatory. Is that BOCU chief super level or commander above?
It's now allowed, I think I'm right in saying, but to be at an inspector level, but the superintendent will always oversee it. And in fact, my commanders who are on, running London, if you like, 24 hours a day, will always know how many Section 60s there are, where they are, why they are, and when they need to be reviewed. So at 3 levels, the authorities, the inspectors, it's immediately reviewed by superintendent and then commander. That's good.
Lastly, I'd commend, it's important that the community is kept informed at an early stage, and again, no questions around that. And all I would say from my experience in the Croydon, Sutton, Bromley aspect is that the commander's been very good in reporting very quickly and the reasons to the community. So I think that's to be noted. Thank you, Chair.
Jeanette?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I just say, Chair, before I start my question, back to Cressida, yes, you talked about the journey many of us have had with you, and can I say, in my last meeting here, sitting opposite you, which is just under 20 years, I think, I think your leadership of the service has been inspiring, and I, like many others, were privileged to be at the service of the 100 years of women in the police, and there was a very poignant moment where I think you were standing there and the youngest member of the service, and it just seemed like the future for women in police is bright.
Thank you.
And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that you were able to, gosh, I don't know how, get through the challenges and the hoops and up these slimy slopes and down again, snakes and ladders, and then become our first.
I knew Jeanette would say a lot nicer things, but can I just support Jeanette?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeanette.
And become our first commissioner of women, and so it's been a joy. And then I suppose that's where the niceness ends from me.
Quite.
Because then, you know, and let's start off about the community, which you've talked about. And I've always made my position clear. The police, if I'm in danger, if I feel unsafe, anybody feels unsafe, we want the police to be there, we want them to come out, and we want them to do their job. But I represent an area, and we've heard about it, where I would say the use of Section 60, and you could say it's because of the nature of the violence incidences, but surely there is a point where you should be getting concerned where Section 60 is then seen by a community or key stakeholders like myself as being routine. Is that appropriate? The use of to the extent where it feels routine.
Well, at one level, of course, sorry, I mean, this may sound like a platitude, but we all wish the violence wasn't happening. We all wish the violence wasn't threatened. And we all wish we didn't have occasions when Section 60 was appropriate. And the fact that it is seen as slightly routine is because there's been a lot of effort by us to get good intelligence, and because sadly there is a considerable threat out on the streets to our particularly young people. But I don't want to see, you know, ever increasing numbers of stop and search with ever, if it were to be the case, decreasing positive outcomes. So I keep an eye on, are we using this really, you know, overall, is it strategically, really purposefully used? What are we getting back from it in terms of weapons, in terms of arrests? What are they for? And I think, and then actually what do we think we did prevent with that Section 60? And obviously sometimes it's hard, of course, because if nothing happens, you don't know. But often you'll hear back from sources who'll say, yeah, the guys weren't coming out tonight because the Met were there. And I think, well, great, because that could be a boy not killed.
I was once out on a duty, and I was told that PC rain is the best deterrent for the criminals because they don't leave their home on a rainy night. I'm not suggesting we produce more rain, but there are so many factors, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely, there are, of course.
That to say that a Section 60 impact is thus, it is so very difficult. But I think what we can say is, because it's used in communities, and certainly the communities I represent, where the dominant population is a black and minority ethnic population, and then when the same young people are repeatedly stopped, they go home to their parents, there is then the increased tension, and then what happens is that when you look at our local figures, satisfaction in the police from BAME, black and minority ethnic members of the communities, is plateaued, and in some instances is lower. Now, I was raising this question about satisfaction between the police and the BAME community less than 20 years ago, and it seems like it's this ongoing, enduring issue. There are police interventions that have, it seems to me, a disproportionate impact on BAME community satisfaction. Are you still looking at that? And are you satisfied that, if you like, the operation is worth it and we'll stay with a plateaued level of satisfaction within these communities?
So I fully recognise that although trust is high in the police, it is lower amongst our BAME communities, particularly, actually specifically those from African and Caribbean origin. I fully recognise that many young people, including particularly BAME young people, don't have the same levels of confidence in their police as their adults do. And I fully recognise this is an issue in some areas of London because of the population demographics. You and I completely agree on this, I think, Jeanette, that we all have to work to help our young people and our BAME communities feel that they really are very well protected by the police, and to have a really good understanding of who we are and how we go about our business and why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that starts in schools, and it isn't a job just for the police to do that. But I'm afraid I am, if you like, unrepentant about the volume of operations and where they are happening, because, as you know, if I just look at 2019, I think I'm right in saying 70% of the people who were victims of homicide in London were BAME. In fact, a very high proportion African Caribbean origin, and every category of homicide on the street, young people, old people. It's a massive issue, and that level of victimisation, not just in homicide, but in stabbings in particular, in the gang-related stuff, is so disproportionate that I think we have to obviously be giving an active and involved and engaged professional police service, at high levels amongst that community. But there's further to go to raise people's understanding of why we're doing that and their confidence, and that's all our jobs, I think.
Yeah, you recently said, talking about staying with young people, in an Evening Standard interview, that you wish to increase police engagement in schools and young people through increased dedicated police officers in schools and pupil referral units. And again, the numbers sort of go into waves up and down in terms of dedicated police officers in schools. Regarding people referral units, and you've done some work through the education panel on this, they're like a rare area. They're either cut or there's a call for more PFUs. So what would be the police's role in a PFU? I didn't understand that in terms of when you said that.
So we have, I think, actually an ever-increasing number of schools officers. I don't recognise the up and downness, although, of course, if you go back over 20 years, like you and I do, there might be some up and down. I do accept that, and also some change in definition of role and that kind of thing. But let's stick with, as it were, the last few years. It's been going up. It continues to go up, and I think that we will be, Robin may be able to tell me roughly when, but we will be at 600 schools officers and youth engagement officers in the foreseeable, touchable future. And they are mostly working full-time in schools. Some are out engaging with youngsters in other ways, but they are in the schools, and they're also in the pupil referral units. So you will find pupil, I was at one the other day where you have two officers who are in the two pupil referral units in the borough, and they spend their time between the two. We know that some are more, if you like, welcoming of police presence than others. There's maybe still a little way for us to go there, but the officers are performing a fantastic role there in keeping the young people safe, helping them to understand the police and humanise the police and understand the law better. And an incredibly important safeguarding role regarded by in the crews that have sort of welcomed them in as a fundamental part of the effort to help those young people divert away from the challenges and criminality that they've got themselves involved in. They are, there's a variety of officers in there, but many of them are, kind of mid-career, very experienced, very bright, very passionate about this work. And they want to be in the PRUs because that's where they think they can make the biggest difference. And they talk about saving lives. I think I've saved several lives here, they say. So I think it's really important work. We want to be doing more of it. And of course, we're working with schools. I'm not even a parent, let alone a head teacher. But I know, I have some idea how difficult it must be. But what I do know is that the best schools take safety incredibly seriously, and they have low exclusions. They try to keep people in education wherever they possibly can, and in the education, if not there, then at a neighbouring school or whatever, before they go into alternative provision and the PRU, and they take some sense of responsibility of people in the PRU. So there's a whole load of work going on here, which Sophie would be better on than I, to try to ensure, A, police are in these places working meaningfully. We're putting the numbers in. B, that they are doing the best possible job alongside their educating job of stopping young people getting further involved in violent crime.
I've just a couple of questions, Chair, for the Deputy Mayor. One is about facial recognition, but before...
I'm going on to
that's
that.
another set.
Oh, that's another... Sorry, definitely, no, go back. It was about the Met stopped, to you, Sophie, that it's my understanding that the Mayor has said that the Met has stopped allowing community monitoring groups to review the footage of officers equipped with body-worn video cameras carrying out stop and searches due to concerns around the general data protection regulation. Do you have a date in mind when this issue will be resolved, and do you have any early indication of how this will be resolved? Because it goes back to the community buy-in into this area of working with the police.
The body-worn video has stopped being shown to the community monitoring groups, but I hope that's going to be resolved very quickly. We're working with the Met, and it's not a barrier that's been put in its place in terms of not wishing to show the body-worn video. There are some technicalities around data protection and GDPR and privacy. We are working through that, and I expect we'll work through that really quickly, because I know myself and the Commissioner are really keen that body-worn video continues to be shown.
And during this stage when the community monitoring groups are not able to review, who is reviewing it then? Who's doing the reviewing?
So we regularly review. We dip sample. We look at we look at particular officers. If there's been a complaint, we might look at other body-worn video. We review after incidents. If there's been a public order arrest or something like that. So we're reviewing a lot and all the time. Just to echo Sophie, this is absolutely the last thing that I wanted to be doing. I was really frustrated when I found out about it, but I'm afraid it is a kind of classic manifestation of some of the challenges we currently have. And I think if you spoke to any public authority, they would say the same, in working out really well, it's not a science, what is appropriate under GDPR and what is not. The first advice came through very quickly. No, if you want to do this, you're going to have to pixelate out all the faces of everybody in the area. Well, that takes about 6 hours per body-worn video. It's not possible. But I would love people to be looking at that. Meanwhile, they're very welcome to come on ride-alongs. They're very welcome to be standing near my officers while they're doing stop and search. We'd encourage people to do that. And that, of course, does not conflict in a rather curious way in my mind, but I'm not a lawyer, with any such law.
Okay, as long as
we'll work our way through it, I hope.
The work is still going on, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I just on that point, which is obviously a concern, a MOPAC officer is not allowed to look at it as well, or is this just anybody outside the police service? Is this the thing you understand? I don't know whether Sophie or
I'd have to double check that. It's not something that MOPAC officers were doing anyway. The community monitoring groups are what they say. They're members of the community coming along locally, scrutinising stop and search. So I'd have to check the technicalities. But what we are trying to work our way through, and I do think it'll be really quick, is ensuring that those community monitoring groups can continue to watch the body-worn video, because I know they have found that helpful, and they, like me and the Commissioner, have been frustrated at not being able to look at it. The body-worn video is important and has been really useful as part of the scrutiny, but it isn't the only scrutiny that's taking place. The community monitoring groups are still working, still scrutinising. We're doing a piece of work with the community monitoring groups from MOPAC around how do we support and enhance the work that they're doing, but also how do we bring more young people into that work, and what is the best way of doing that. We're doing a piece of research with young people at the moment about how best to do that, and how do we ensure that their voices are there and they are also able to scrutinise and review the stop and search that's happening in their area. It's really important that the community monitoring groups are diverse and reflect the communities they're serving.
Yeah, I think I've previously raised the fact that some of the youth wings of the community monitoring groups have not been able to see the footage either. And you can sort of see why there would be concerns, but I think it's really important that somebody outside the police service is regularly looking at this. The Mayor refers to it as game-changing. It's only game-changing if there is oversight. And I appreciate the offer to go and be alongside officers, but there's obviously the Heisenberg uncertainty principle at play there. And the point about the game-changingness is you never, when doing the job, the officer never knows who might be reviewing that footage, and I think it's really important that we do have that independent oversight of it restored, even if it's just within MOPAC for the time being because of concerns. I do have a few more questions about stop and search.
Coming very quickly, Sean, to interject. Deputy Mayor,
Sorry.
That's all right. Can you get back to us on this? Because the briefing note that some of us have, and this may be inaccurate, tells us that the Mayor has said that whilst community groups are not allowed to view the footage, the review process will be undertaken by the Deputy Mayor's team. That's what we would like to believe. So it'd be good to get some clarification. We might be wrong. So.
Okay, I'll get back to you.
Chair, could I just say, I mean, I take your point, Sean, but I do think there is also a massive game changer in the very rare instances at the moment where people complain, the evidence is there. The evidence is shown in court. There's a whole series of ways in which, and of course the IOPC, if they're in court involved, straight away, first thing they ask for, body-worn video, please. So it is really a game changer in lots of ways, but I would love it to be able to be scrutinised in a way which, at the same time doesn't cause the problems that you've obviously indicated if, hypothetically a youngster was looking at the video and sees somebody they know and sees something difficult and then there's a complaint and what about my privacy, so it's quite it's a complicated area of law.
Sean, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to clear something up about knife crime and the statistics that we've talked about, because earlier on you mentioned homicides have risen. You also mentioned if you look at the rates of knife crime on the dashboard that you provide, you can see that knife crime rates have risen. Now the one in between in terms of seriousness is knife crime with injury, and if you look at that on the dashboard, you can see that that goes up and down and up and down, and there isn't an overall trend with that. And so I just wanted to clarify that the knife crime basic numbers, they include fines through stop and search. And therefore, there might be some confounding there in that increased stop and search is pushing up the fines and therefore the numbers, like a detection rate. And whether or not, because I think you tried to say earlier on that you thought violence with injury was down and that although the homicide rate is up. And just what's your feeling about the underlying trends here? This medium level, is that reassuring, or is the lower level going up a warning sign that we might expect the more serious crimes to increase in future?
Right. So I did try to pick my words carefully, and as somebody else said, we don't want to be swapping figures here unhelpfully, but my take is that knife injury victims under 25, not domestic violence, have been reducing substantially over the last 18 months. Violence with injury is down in 2019. Overall violence with injury is down, I think, about 8%. That's what I said. Overall knife crime, which is a very wide basket indeed, but, and I will double check, Sean, I'm 99% sure does not actually include possession, but I'll check that. Overall knife crime has been kind of up a bit, down a bit, up a bit, down a bit, and is still not coming down in the way I would like it to. Robbery, up considerably. So I can see some elements, if you like, really turning in the right direction. Moped-enabled crime, down for 2 years. But these are big figures, the knife crime overall, and robbery is 37,000, something like that, personal robbery. These are large numbers, and we're putting a massive effort now into trying to bring those numbers faster down. Underlying trend, I do think, is that we are suppressing violence. I use that word advisedly. I think in the coming year, you should expect reductions in, again, knife injury under 25, I hope, and I hope to turn the tide of rise in robbery, at least plateauing and hopefully coming down. Knife injury, knife crime overall also start to bring it down properly.
Okay, that's really useful. I think it's really important to look at all the different parts of the statistics and not cherry pick. And I think, you're not. I'm not accusing you of doing that. I'm saying it is to get that out in the open. I want to ask about Section 60 again. There isn't a Section 60 dashboard. The stop and search dashboard doesn't seem to outline how many Section 60s there are. And so we've asked in the past through I can't find it, although the dashboards, I have to say, don't work very well on iPads. Just if I can feed that back. Parts of the screen are missing, so possibly it's tucked away on the right-hand side of the screen. But yeah, no, what I'm trying to find out is, in the past, we've asked through MQs and during this meeting for lists of borough-wide Section 60s. I get the alerts from the police, and I keep an eye on a lot of police social media feeds. It seems to me like more of them that are coming through are potentially not at borough level. There are a couple of wards, but I can't. That's just my view. I'd like to get the data if that's possible. So if we can get potentially the number of Section 60s, and then a list of the borough-wide ones. Last time we asked, I think there were substantial numbers of borough-wide ones, like dozens, but it was possible to provide in a list form so we could see which ones had been issued. I'd just like to keep an eye on that. Obviously, if that could be added to the dashboard, that'd be better as well.
So I don't have those figures to my fingertips, the borough-wide ones. Don't think Sophie does. We do keep an eye on it, and I think you're right. And they're not going up; they're coming down, if you like, and certainly as a proportion of the whole. They're not a very high proportion anyway. It's not really for me to say whether it needs to be on the dashboard, but we can certainly provide you with the figures for 2019.
So the briefing I've got in front of me says that the figures aren't uploaded for December, but they should be, there should be November figures on the dashboard. So I'm not quite sure what's happening.
What's the name of the dashboard?
I don't know what.
I was looking at the stop and search dashboard.
Okay, so I'll come back to you on what's on the dashboard. Can I just say on Section 60, one of the things I wanted to say in sort of response to some of Jeanette's questioning, it's absolutely right that there's proper monitoring and scrutiny, not just the stop and search, but Section 60 as well. And you can see that, and I've had, as Commissioner talked about, a briefing about how tightly gripped and controlled that is within the Met. Myself and the Mayor went out to Seven Kings after the awful murder of the 3 young men a couple of weeks ago. A Section 60 had been put in straight away, but the Borough Commander told us that it was taken out about 6 o'clock that morning because it was reviewed really quickly and it was deemed not to be appropriate. And for me, that was a really good example of Section 60s being used, but also being withdrawn because actually it no longer is needed. So they are, in terms of people feeling it's the norm, they are very carefully used and very carefully thought about it in terms not just when they're put in, but how long they are maintained for. The other things I just wanted to say about Section 60 as well is, although we have seen a real increase, and we of course have seen the increase in violence as well, we do need to, 2 things I'd like to sort of put it into context. One is we are nowhere near the industrialisation of the use of Section 60 that we had sort of in 2011. Your own Police and Crime Committee report from 2011 put the number of Section 60 stops and searches under Section 60 at 4,000 a month. But we are nowhere near that, and I do think we need to put that into context. Yes, we are seeing it increasing, but it is, it's not an increase in the way that back to 2011 levels. And the other thing is, of course, Section 60 was used twice at Notting Hill, and in the August of Section 60 stops and searches, up to 20% of those stops and searches that are under Section 60 were to do with Notting Hill. So we just to put the rise in Section 60 into context a bit.
Thank you. Just to go back to I'm just trying to get. Sorry. That was a very useful amount of information in response to my question of can we have a list. So to carry on with this kind of more factual questioning, I think that is the point. My instinct is that we've put up a challenge here. We've scrutinised and questioned the borough-wide Section 60s, the number of Section 60s, and that there has been some restraint and some more careful processes put in place, but I want to investigate that and get the actual data. So the other thing about Section 60 that we've raised in the past is the communication of them live to people on the ground. So the people are aware there's a Section 60 in place when they are going about their daily business. I know we've talked in the past about social media, and the reliance of the police on putting out social media alerts seems to be quite heavy. And I don't know if you're aware that most social media feeds now do not show you a real-time feed. So if the police put out a notice and you're following the police in your area that says we're instituting a Section 60, it does not necessarily appear in the feed of the people who are following the police service. There's a curated feed, you see the friends you interact with most first. And are the police looking at this and checking to see the levels of awareness of Section 60s because of this change? I think social media was potentially a good way of doing it, but you cannot know, I think, exactly how many people are seeing these now because of the way that Twitter and Facebook have changed how they operate.
I don't think we are. I don't think we are looking at that. I don't think we have therefore responded to that. If people have ideas of what we could do differently, I'd always be open to hearing that. But you know, I had Steve saying he thinks the communication's really good. I remember being here 18 months ago.
I'm looking at a tweet from MPS Croydon, and they can, you know, this is a sea change in communications.
Yeah, but my question is,
if I can continue without interruption, it's a sea change in communications over previous years. It's probably not perfect. Do we ever get perfect? But I've seen a significant improvement.
I'm not saying they're not sending tweets. I'm saying
anyway, that's enough of that. Thank you.
I'm conscious of the time,
Time is running out.
Move on to the next section, which is...
Can I just say, I think social media is a really important tool, and I think what you bring up, I don't know the answer to that, but it's not the only tool for communicating Section 60, and that's what Steve's talking about, and it's certainly not the only tool across London. It's just one of the ways of communicating to stakeholders in the community. But the issue about particular feeds, I don't know the answer to.
They rely a lot on social media.
Can we just move on, because I'm conscious that some members have to leave around 12 o'clock. So a subsection of the section on violent crime, 5 minutes and 5 minutes only, because I know Assembly Member Sean Barry will be writing to you, Commissioner, with lots more questions on facial recognition. So if Assembly Member Pigeon wants to start, and then Sean, you come in. But can we do this within 5 minutes?
Yes, thank you very much. Obviously, the Met announced on the 24th of January it's going to begin the operational use of live facial recognition technology. But Commissioner, last June, I think before this committee, you, and I quote you, said you were miles away from being able to deploy facial recognition technology. So can you explain to me how in the last 7 months things have just changed so significantly?
Absolutely. I mean, Caroline, also we have worked together for a long time, and I'm not saying this in any disrespectful way at all. I wonder whether that was in a particular context. However, what I can say is we have done an enormous amount of work in the last several months, and we have, as you know, trialled a particular form of technology. We're very, very comfortable with the algorithm that we now have. We're very comfortable with the checks and balances. And I think, speaking to many people, even those you might think of as naysayers, the announcement that Nick fronted but went up on our website on earlier on this month was extremely comprehensive, extremely transparent, and extremely clear. And all that takes a lot of work to get to that stage. But I am confident in our ability to do an effective and proper operational deployment with good technology, but more equally with good trained human operators who will always make the most important decision.
So you're confident in the technology? Because I recall last June, I remember the discussion here, and I was actually reassured that you said, I think, we're some way off using that yet, because it felt that from your previous deployments, the technology wasn't there, and your own evaluation identified flaws in procedures, practices, human rights compliance. So I felt reassured this was going to be some way off, but suddenly 7 months later you're rolling it out.
Well, I can't tell you what exactly timescale was in my mind when I said that, because I just genuinely can't remember. But what I would say is it is 7 months. There's been an enormous amount of work, and things have got better and better and better in a whole variety of ways. But actually, even the pilots, they taught us a lot about processes. But during those, you know, the technology we were using was improved each time.
Okay. Are you able to provide us with the details, things like the human rights assessments that the Met have undertaken in advance of not just the rollout, but actually proper use of this technology going forward?
So I would just suggest that anybody who's really interested looks at all the enormous volume of material that we have put on our website, and there is a huge amount there which shows how seriously we take the human rights issues.
Information include, you're going to have this issue of watch lists and you're going to review them on a 24-hour basis. Does it give you the specific criteria for someone who would be included on a watch list that would be caught up through the use of this technology?
And so no, I don't think it does, because it could, it could change with deployments. What we do is we will be doing is creating a watch list which is specific for that deployment, which is destroyed after the deployment, and that will be specific to serious violent wanted offenders in that area, say.
Okay, so it would be specific to each operation. Yeah. Okay. An area that I've raised before that I'm concerned about is around children. And I understand children can and will be included on watch lists, and although there are certain procedures in place regarding under 18s and under 13s, it has been proven this technology is far less accurate with children and young people. So what I want is an assurance from you, how you're ensuring London doesn't become a city where young people feel that they're unnecessarily subject to intrusive and potentially frightening police stops with the use of this technology.
So perhaps I could sort of go back a little bit and just say this is part, but just a part of our desire to reduce violent crime in London, and also to be a modern, technologically enabled police service which is making best use within the law ethically of technologies that are available to us. And of course we want, which is why we've been so transparent, people to have confidence in our use of it. There are a huge number of strange myths around already about how we are going to use it. So I've already said, for example, that the watch list is specific and it is destroyed afterwards. No image of anybody walking through is kept. It will be deleted immediately unless there is a match. And if there is a match, i.e. the machine says this could be Cressida Dick, then that will be kept for just 30 days. And it will then be deleted. So when you come to children and young people, of course it is not impossible that a serious violent wanted offender in that area where we are deploying is a younger person. Of course that's possible. But their images will be deleted, and nothing will be kept, whether they are a young, in the longer run, whether they're a young person who walks through and there's a match, or the young person walks through and there is no match. And the checks and balances in this are huge, Caroline. They really are. So I think it will be obviously relatively rare that it would be a very young person on the watch list, but we can't guarantee there'll be none. But I don't think young people should be concerned about that. It's not linked to any other databases. I am not familiar with what you say about there's an element of inability to discriminate, as in the best use of the word, properly between individuals when they are younger. But let's not forget, there will always be a human being, in fact more than one human being. So the machine will say that looks like, if only Cressida Dick aged 16, and then the human being will look at the image and say, no, that's not right, or could be, and ask another officer, highly trained officer on the street, to look at that person, make a decision, and possibly to speak to them. So it's not, I really feel people are being peddled sort of fibs about the way we're going to use it. And if people do have the time to look at the website, I'm sure you have, but others as well should urge you to look at the very tight and restrained way in which it's being used.
It's our job. I understand some members may support. It's our job is, when something like this, which is controversial, our job is to question you and make sure processes are properly in place. And I am nervous. It's a very big change for me in some ways, as a new tool for you, so I want to make sure it's right. I wanted to perhaps come to the Deputy Mayor next, because in July last year you said you were going to continue to lobby for a national legal framework for police forces using facial recognition. So how comfortable are you with the Met using this technology without that national framework being in place?
So when we discussed this in July last year, there were two things I said, which one, that the Met wouldn't be, and we had the assurances from the Commissioner and as well, the Met wouldn't be using deployed live facial recognition until the recommendations of the ethics panel had been addressed. One of the things that you'll see on the website and as part of the announcement of the Metropolitan Police on January the 24th was the response from Assistant Commissioner Nick Ethgrave to the ethics panel, recommendations on how they've been met. And actually that answers some of your questions, I think, about watch lists, because it puts down the principles and the standard operating procedures and decision-making process as to what will be on a watch list and how long they'll be kept. And the other thing I did say, as part of the ethics panel report as well, that we would be lobbying, and we will continue to lobby for that national framework. It will be, I think the government should be making it, making it as clear as possible for police forces across the country what they are able to do and what they aren't able to do. But the deployment and the decision of the Metropolitan Police to use live facial recognition, there's a legal mandate on the website. So in terms of the decision that's been taken, it is not it's not dependent on there being a national framework in place. We would still like that national framework, because I think it would make police forces across the country's lives much easier, and they'll feel more supported in using not just live facial recognition but any other new technology that comes along.
Okay, but just to clarify, you and the Mayor are satisfied with the Met's response to the ethics panel's review on facial recognition technology?
I think you'll see that the response has been one that has been really thorough, and there's been a lot of work put into place.
Are you satisfied with it?
I am satisfied in terms of the decision that was taken to go forward. Each deployment is going to need more, it's going to need to be adhered to the standard operating procedures, privacy impact assessments. So there is, there's more to be done for each deployment as well. But over the overarching strategic response is one that we're satisfied with.
Okay, thank you.
So can I ask you, Deputy Mayor, a little bit more, and I think we're going to need to write to you with some more questions. I think possibly the committee ought to write to probably the Deputy Mayor and the Commissioner. I have a lot of questions which will take too long to go through here about the timeline of the decision that was made and the correspondence that there was between the Mayor's office, the police and other public bodies like the Information Commissioner, and what correspondence there was in terms of answering questions. And I think that's much better done in writing. Okay. But can I just check? We have this letter from the Assistant Commissioner, which is dated 23rd of January to the Mayor, outlining the response to the ethics panel. Then nowhere in that letter does it say, and tomorrow we're going to announce that we're going to start using it on the streets in deployment. Was the Mayor aware of the decision ahead of time? This letter came with some other communication that said the context for this letter.
Yes, we were aware of that.
Okay, and did you saw the legal framework ahead of the announcement? Because the legal framework is dated the day of the announcement.
We did see the legal mandate before, yeah.
And did you have any questions for the Met in response to either the letter or the legal mandate or the other documents that came out?
No, I mean those in terms of the letter that came over from Nick Ethgrave and the legal mandate, they're very clear and very solid, and you can see the amount of work that has been put in place, and the seriousness within which the Metropolitan Police has addressed those recommendations.
Yeah. Okay. So the gaps I can see, as some of them are to do with the things we observed when we went to see the trials, in terms of operational things on the ground, letting people know that it was going on, the ability to opt out, the ability to unmatch people within the settings. Would it be possible for the committee to visit an early deployment in order to see whether these very practical on the ground issues have been addressed?
I think that's a question for me, and the answer is of course, yes.
Thank you.
It was a very long 5 minutes. So just to finish on this section, Commissioner, firstly, can I say that having personally been out on patrol with the Well-Income Task Force, we were impressed. I think all of us who went. So, some very effective work, frontline policing work, and they need to be commended.
Thank you.
And also just in terms of social media, I think it's quite encouraging to see a lot of individual police officers, commanders, superintendents going on social media, exchanging. A lot of them follow me, and I think it just helps transparency, and I follow them back. So let's move on. I'm trying to increase my following from 5,500 to 6,000 so in the next few months. Met structural changes, and we will have to speed up. Questions to be led by Assembly Member, I think, was it Tony?
Me.
Caroline Pigeon, yeah, sorry.
Yes, I was just going to lead on the first bit, and I think I can condense the questions we've got. I want to understand about police station closures, because we've had mixed messages so far this year. So the Mayor very clearly before the Budget Committee said everything's on pause. The Deputy Commissioner last month said no, no, no. We've reviewed the estate strategy, that's complete. We want you to sell it all. And Sophie, you said you'd be getting that soon. And then the Mayor, I think just recently, in answer to my question, committed that the outcome of this would be publicly available and a decision made before the pre-election period started. So where are we with the police estate review and your sale of police stations, please?
Can I suggest we start with Robin?
Robin, yeah,
and,
of course.
And Deputy Mayor after that, maybe.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So just to be very, very clear then, I don't think Steve said everything was moving ahead at full pace and such like. So obviously we've got the great challenge to have of how do we absorb large numbers of extra police officers, which is a very big change from where we were. It's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
So to be very, very clear, what we are doing at the moment, and this work will expect to be completed this month, is reviewing all of our estate. Those buildings that we were anyway very clear about intending to keep, those buildings that we're refurbishing, but actually looking at our options within our existing estate for how we would absorb extra officers. And of course we don't yet know how many extra officers we are going to get. We've asked for, and we've said very clearly we'd like 6,000, but that's not a decision government have made. So we are putting together a set of plans that says if the Met were to grow to 34,000, broadly speaking, geographically spread, what buildings would we need to keep that we would otherwise have disposed of? 35,000, 6,000, 37,000. And we, of course, are not going to proceed, as the Mayor had said, with a station closure that is in that category that we might then regret. However, there are parcels of land that we are very clear that we will not need and will want to continue to dispose of. The site at Paddington Green, some land linked to Hendon, some sites at Wembley which were in the past used for operational feeding, which aren't police stations, and which we are very confident that is appropriate in order that we can achieve capital receipts to be able to invest in the estate that we will need.
Okay,
so I hope that's,
so
I hope
you're
that's
saying
clear.
there are some bits of land, and they had said at Budget Committee, Paddington Green, some land up at Hendon and so on, were going ahead. But you're telling me everything else is on pause.
So we will, by the end of this month, we will be in a clearer position as a management board to then advise the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor whether we have enough certainty to be able to recommend that there are some buildings that definitely, as far as we can possibly see, will not be needed, in which case we would want to advise at that stage that we proceed to dispose of. And I hope to be in that position by the end of February to be able to make that recommendation.
So end of February, that goes over to you, Sophie, as Deputy Mayor. You'll be then signing
End of
off
February, we will discuss as a... the work will be completed by the end of February. And then it will come to our management board to enable it to then come across to MOPAC.
Okay, and so are you expecting this to then make a decision, Sophie, by 23rd, whatever it is, of March, or is that not going to be possible?
Can I just? I think what's implicit in the question is that it's a straight line, as it were, to here's a plan and here's a set of decisions. We don't, as I said at the start, we don't know how many extra officers we are going to get. Therefore, we need to plan on a range of assumptions, and we're going to have some choices about how much flexibility we feel as though we have to build into the estate and absorb the extra costs that come with that. And so there will be a set of conversations we'll need to have around, as I say, just how many buildings we think we have to and should keep, just in case the Met grows to the fullest possible amount. Where we are confident that in a particular geography there is accommodation that we, under no circumstances, would not need, then it is possible that we will want to bring those for decisions to the Deputy Mayor at that point, if they're buildings that we would want to dispose of in the next 12 months. We work on the basis of bringing a 12-month disposal schedule forward. But I don't know until the work's completed whether or not there will be any buildings in that category that are content, this building is not needed. Not needed in the short term as a decant site for the buildings that we're refurbishing, or in the long term. I don't know whether there will be any buildings in that site, but there won't be.
There's some land and Paddington Green that you've mentioned.
Indeed.
So they will be coming forward, and there may be others once you've looked at your range of assumptions. And that will then come to Sophie, and Sophie, then you will make a decision based on that. Are you expecting to make that decision before the 23rd of March?
So, we've
No, but really wanted to
So
get
I
from the
think we
Deputy
should
Mayor,
be
because it goes over all this work you're doing, and I get it's complicated, of course I do, there's lots of uncertainty. It becomes Sophie, will you then be making a decision?
If after MOPAC officers have scrutinised it, I mean, this doesn't just come straight to me and there's no scrutiny and there's no conversations.
Yeah.
If after all that, before we're going to run up against pre-election
That's
period.
why I was asking.
If there are some properties that we can dispose of, I'd expect to make the decisions before that.
Yeah.
I expect that will be some of the larger properties. It will depend on the review. I would also just like to put in, again, a bit of context. I mean, the head of property in the Metropolitan Police once said to me, trying to review and plan the properties and the services for the Met was a bit like playing four-dimensional chess. This is an incredibly complex and complicated. Even if you had the set number of officers, this is incredibly complicated. And on top of that, we actually don't know, apart from next year, what growth is going to be. This is, a confoundingly complex problem to solve. But we also have the confoundingly complex problem to solve that we have a capital budget. We know we have to invest in IT. We know we have to, renew. We've talked about renewing tablets, renewing body-worn video, renewing vehicles. We have £9 million next year from the government to pay for that. So we are up against it in terms of budgets, and we also have the complexity of the decision-making. That's not to excuse or to say, we can't do it. But when you say, well, will you make that decision before March the 23rd? We hope to take some decisions before March 23rd.
On some of it. And some of it may well be paused or just held until you've got more certainty.
And it will inevitably then be an iterative process.
Yes.
Inevitably an iterative process when we get more clarity from government about the size and scope, and also in terms of our decisions around deployment across London of the new officers.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, moving on to the next section, borough mergers, safer, or subsection rather, borough mergers and safer neighbourhood teams. Sylvia Barber.
I think that's me actually.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, a big subject, but we'll touch upon the new or the newish, in fact not so new borough mergers, which have actually been around now for some time. I think my one was the last one coming in. Really, probably initially, perhaps Robin and then Commissioner. What's your thoughts so far on about the success or otherwise of the mergers?
Yeah, I'm very happy to start. So this was obviously a huge change for the Met, and a change that was made even more difficult for us to implement because of needing to do so at a time of reduced resources. So we were implementing this change at a time when officer numbers were reducing. But in terms of an operating model for the Met, with a local policing structure built around 12 broadly similar operating models, but with local tailoring where appropriate. We absolutely are content that it's the right operating model, it's the right basis for us to proceed going forward.
How are you evidencing that? I mean, you've explained what it is, and we all know around here what it is, because we experienced it. How are you justifying, or not justifying, but measuring the fact of your conclusion that it's successful?
So it's successful. It's successful in the context of what we were trying to achieve, of reorganising the Met at a time of uncertain resources, and indeed reducing resources at the time. We have demonstrated that we're able to do that. We've been able to reduce management supervision and reinvest that money. We've been able to reinvest money into officers into safeguarding where there was high demand. We've been able to reinvest officers into schools officers, doubling the number of schools officers, which we've got 469, I think is the number today, and we are confident that we will get that number close to the 600 target by the end of the year. So we are confident we've been able to put the resources where we want to, despite taking out net 1,500 fewer officers. We've broadly been able to maintain our targets of response targets, I-grade targets have broadly been in the high 80s over the last few months. As the Commissioner has said, we are starting to see the impact on our critical crime types and are being able to mobilise the Met to confront the challenges of violence. And equally, what we're seeing at a time of growth is the ability, using the 12 units, to be able to bring through our new recruits into a consistent and effective operating model, being able to absorb them through the system, give them experience of the various specialisms, which would have been so hard to achieve if we were operating on 32 different iterations of policing across London.
And these 350 per month start rolling through, the setup will be better able, capacity-wise, to bring them on quicker than they would have done before.
Absolutely. So we're able to, and we've now mobilising 12 training units, if you like, on BCUs, which would not have been possible to do that 32 times. We've got street duty courses that will be consistent. And one of the great advantages of the BCU model is for us to be able to work with 12 BCU commanders to drive consistency, but equally to drive standards higher with that collaborative group of 12 people wanting to learn from each other.
I mean, I'll bring a question in a minute. A driving force, and perhaps, Commissioner, you can comment on it, was clearly the safeguarding issue. Was the report of the Met's performance or lack of around safeguarding. And now in the BOCUs we have, and this is a kind of contradiction, integrated but separate groups with managed superintendent level, particularly looking at safeguarding. I asked Cressida really, is this now seeing, and it will be evidence at the right time, an improvement in the safeguarding structures, in your view?
Absolutely. I think it is an improvement. I mean, the whole thing has been, reviewed as we've gone, as you know, and subject to a recent review by DSC Pearson, who many of you know, and that has made some further changes, for example, in the shift pattern and in relation to responsibilities. But in terms of safeguarding, we had this enormous increase in volume, and some of the units were just not able to sustain dealing with those. Bringing them together so that you do have sexual offences, child abuse, I know many people are expert on this, and domestic abuse together has had some huge advantages. Having that scale that you have to be able then to respond to changes in demand or very significant investigations. And then the co-location of larger teams allows better coordination and wider support within safeguarding, and gives partners a greater clarity, I think, than they used to have. But you've all, all of you have been on, as it were, hearing about this, thinking about this locally. I'm not going to suggest it's all been easy. No. I am absolutely convinced that it is a better model overall, given that the shape of the Met. It's not one that in growth, I'm going to go back to, just to be clear. I'm not going to reverse, for example, back to borough-based. I don't think that's right. I think this is a good model, and it is allowing us to do a lot of things at a higher standard and better, and cope with more demand than we ever would have been able to do.
Okay. I mean, the whole subject of BOCUs and borough mergers is a very large subject, and I'm sure this committee will return to it with a bit more details, more figures around that, either in this term or under your chairmanship next term. However, I'd like to turn to safe enabled teams within the structure, and we're saying, Robin, that it's looking good, things are working well. We've all got feedback, I'm sure those are certainly constituency members, about issues around resourcing and numbers in safe enabled teams. It has ever been thus, and I understand that, but I can speak from my end of the London, Croydon and Sutton particularly. I'm getting a lot of feedback around safe enabled teams being significantly under resource, even more than you kind of expect through natural flow. Would you like to comment on that in the context of the BOCUs, your thoughts around SNTs? Have they been good for SNTs is probably a simple question.
So I'm just searching for the actual number that are the percentage that's currently got the two DBOs and one PCSO, 86% and such like. But of course it does change, and it does change as people move around the organisation. But we're absolutely clear that the value of there being named colleagues who understand the community and who can be that conduit into that micro-community at ward level is critically important. We're clear on it. It's never been in debate through the model, and we value it. Just as the Commissioner said earlier, in terms of valuing the kind of schools officer aspect of that at the moment, we do everything we possibly can to minimise abstraction from that resource or commitment that we made, other than in the most extreme circumstances, which I know you have been briefed on in the past. And the one thing that I think, and you will see this when you're out and about, I know, and certainly when I am, the kind of the commitment and the passion, the dedication that you see from people who want to dedicate themselves to that kind of ward role is outstanding. And so from a perspective of it, is it the right part of the model to be based at that, having dedicated ward officers? We're content that it is, and we continue to work hard at improving those local partnerships.
Yeah, because, I mean, indeed, we talked earlier about the violent crime piece, but there is a very positive effect that the neighbourhood teams do have in those areas, in the North Croydons and other areas, on suppressing violent crime and confidence. And I'll move now swiftly onto the confidence debate. We've had a exchange a little bit earlier, and I want to concentrate on confidence, not satisfaction, which is easily conflated too often. Satisfaction, which we know is about the experiences of Londoners once they've had dealings, that's been a victim and they've had dealings with the officers. Confidence is a different thing, a difficult thing to measure and a difficult thing to influence, but confidence is indeed reducing. Do you see the Boku project as improving that, or has that had a negative effect at these early stages on confidence? Cressida, do you have any thoughts around confidence with the whole community, not just necessarily the Bain community?
So you're right, of course, nationally and more so, but also within the Met, confidence has reduced. Not a huge amount, I would say, but we might argue about that, but it has reduced over the last couple of years. We've also, in part, reduced the confidence gap between those who are more and less, which I'm pleased about, but of course I'm not pleased that confidence in general, as we currently measure it, has reduced. I think there are some things there about measurement. It is quite a complicated thing that leads somebody to feel confident or not confident, and I think there's been a massive, the overwhelming thing that I think that has driven this personally is the concern there is around violent crime and officer numbers. And everybody knows that their Met has been stretched, and everybody knows violent crime has been high. So I can't, or higher than we would all like, and I can't really say more than that. I can't say how much any changes that we have been through, which go well beyond so-called borough mergers, have affected people's sense of both their own personal safety and confidence in the Met. But what I know is we, and not just us, but all of us, need to be trying to drive it up, of course.
I think
going through change is always difficult. And
it's more of a cause and effect. If you have the neighbourhood teams out there, full, numbers of the right number of numbers visible, naturally people will feel more comfortable in the neighbourhoods because they see that visibility. I think also it's not necessarily the violent. They will hear bad things happening in violence in London, and it won't be touching them, thank God, but they hear about it. That may affect confidence. But also what affects confidence is the other end of the spectrum. Things like burglaries, things like shoplifting, that often don't get investigated. Crime assessment policy has been underlined here. So there's the other end of the spectrum, the other end about confidence in the Met Police. When there's a burglary, I had something, I won't quote it directly, but I had an experience in my ward where there was a hall that was burgled, and the officers said, well, have you got CCTV? No. And they were supportive and came round, but it wasn't investigated. That's just a small example. Do you think the crime assessment policy itself is having a cause and effect on general confidence in the Met Police?
So we've always had something like the crime assessment policy. The one you're referring to has, of course, been reviewed and amended to try to ensure that we do give a better service to people in certain types of circumstances. And we will continue to do that in the future. I wouldn't want crime assessment policies to be muddled with reorganisation and restructuring.
No,
I
don't want to conflate the two.
Yeah, it's absolutely, thank you, Steve. It's a completely separate issue, but they both go to the point about rising demand and rising complexity and rising strain on policing, of course, which we saw throughout the last several years. And where we are able, setting the level of service we can give people in certain types of circumstances is directly affected by, obviously, how we prioritise things, but secondly, even before that, how much we're having and how complex it is. So I absolutely know that burglary is a horrible crime, and burglary victims feel it very, very personally. If people talk about feeling violated by a burglary, I know that. And that's why we're putting more resources into burglary prevention and indeed support to burglary victims. And similarly with other crime types, I would hope that with the growth, you'll have more officers on the streets, you'll have more people in certain functions, there'll be less violent crime, and both confidence and satisfaction, not taking away from neighbourhoods, which we will maintain at this kind of level, or review for more, let's see, that we will see these figures go back up.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Just a very quick one, if I may. The resource allocation formula, when is that going, the baseline of that going to be looked at or changed?
So as part of the review of you're talking about the internal formula or the government formula?
No, I'm talking about
the internal formula.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's about in looking at demand across our BCUs.
No, I know what it is. I know it's
so
2016.
we used we looked again at demand across the BCUs as part of the review that Amanda Pearson undertook recently, looking at whether or not there were the right balance of resources across our BCUs and whether any further changes are needed. So it's part of the review that Amanda recently undertook.
So is it being changed?
There's no fundamental change to the formula, no. But what I'm saying is we've looked at the how the demands have changed across the BCUs as part of that review, which is what it's about, of course, and making sure that we're balancing resources across London in the most effective way, keeping pace with changing demands and changing patterns.
Well, that's why I wondered whether it was going to be changed in order that I've been contacted by Mike Freer MP, concerned because of the allocations in Barnet. Barnet, Harrow and Brent have the lowest of everyone, and we were wondering whether that was going to be changed.
So the basic formula is not, to my best of my knowledge, isn't being looked at and reviewed at the moment. But as I said, I don't know the exact outcome for that BCU from the work that Amanda undertook, but we have certainly looked at whether the balance of resources across BCUs, and as we look to how we will be deploying growth coming forward, we will want to be looking at where demand and patterns of crime have changed and shifted, so that we are ensuring that any additional resource we've got to be able to invest into BCUs is invested in the right proportion, rather than just being applied as a consistent pattern across London.
Okay, but it was the original baseline of it, whether that was in itself going to be changed, if you look at how it's all changed, so that then if you get 1,000 more police officers,
yes.
if the baseline is changed, because it said in your Metropolitan Force Management Statement that it had been in place since 2016 and it should be looked at because the data was too old.
So as I've said, as part of Amanda's review, she looked at the data going into that formula and she's refreshed the data. We've not reviewed the formula, the basis on which we are undertake that allocation. We've looked at the data going into that formula and we will look to take any outcome, any results of that forward as part of our consideration of how we might invest further resources. So, for example, the response, I do know that the demand going into the response service across London has increased, and therefore we need to look at whether or not we should be rebalancing our response demand across London. So I just haven't got the detail of that BCU, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Joanne, I don't know, you've got to go soon, but if you could just quickly do your
I want
questions
to ask
on...
about the government's police funding settlement. It is a slight uplift on last year's allocation. Part of that is obviously for the new police officers. But with cost of inflation and so forth, does this significantly allow you to change the way you're operating, or is more money needed?
So it is obviously a positive and good settlement in the context of us being able to grow police officers. So just it has to be said that going back 2 or 3 years when we were having to consider a Met at 27,000 police officers, to be talking here today about the challenge of where we might put 33,000 officers is fantastic. What we're very clear though with government is it needs to be a balanced uplift. And we need to be able to have the investment to be able to invest in the estates we've talked about, but equally ensure that we're able to invest in fleet equipment technology, to be able to invest in forensics, in criminal justice, intelligence processes. And we're still examining in detail the year one allocation that we've got and our growth allocation. It's clearly enough for us to be able to recruit the extra officers. It clearly gives us extra capacity. We are currently finalising our work on exactly what is needed. How much extra do we need to put into forensics to accommodate the extra number of police officers? Do we need to increase our custody provision? How do we keep the Met in step? So for year one, we are feeling reasonably positive about that. The challenge will come in years 2, 3, and 4. Obviously, next year we get full year impact of the growth in police officers this year, and if the government don't fund pay and inflation, kind of going forward, with effectively a lock on officer numbers now, any costs and any efficiencies would have to fall on those areas of our budget, which have been the areas that we have focused most on in terms of managing the last 6 years of austerity. So as we go into the spending review period, we will obviously be wanting to talk to government about ensuring that the funding for the officer uplift remains balanced, so the Met can remain balanced, that we continue to fund pay and inflation. And of course, from a London perspective, we'll continue to talk to government about the absence of full funding for our national and capital city allocations.
That hasn't gone up at all.
So that hasn't gone up at all, it's a significant issue for us. It's one that we regularly talk to the Home Office about, and we definitely will continue to do so.
Okay. I think it's quite interesting to hear how welcoming you are of this uplift after nearly 7 to 8 years of drastic cuts in our police force and the difficulties it creates in trying to restart. And we've had a conversation about police stations before, but obviously there were drastic cuts to police staff as well, and with the increase in officers that you obviously want to get out on the streets as much, are you looking to have to increase police civilian staff as well?
Yeah, so as part of the work that I talked about keeping the Met in balance, that will be part of it. Obviously, we want to ensure that every penny of the extra money that we're getting is invested wisely in the right places. So we are not simply reversing changes that were made previously. That would be the wrong thing to do. But as an example, we do need more people in my HR teams to be able to cope with the increase in recruitment. We will need more civilian officers working in forensics in order to cope with what we expect to see a further throughput. I suspect we will need to increase the number of dedicated detention officers in our custody estate. The one thing that we continue to say we need most from government, though, is long-term certainty. And the rollercoaster ride of growth and cut is the thing that is most disruptive to us. And the challenge, in response to some of Steve's questions as well, some of the challenge that we face now is, of course, the level of inexperience in our organisation, because we haven't had a consistent kind of recruitment plan over the last 3 to 4 years. So whilst on paper it is now looking as though we are at our former strength of 31,000 officers, over 1,800 of those will be in the first 5 months of training. Over 20% of our detective numbers are in training. So whilst it looks on paper as though, when we think about the kind of the effectiveness of our safeguarding teams, over 20% of that will be inexperienced kind of colleagues. So it's a great problem to have. But what we need is long-term planning, long-term certainty, so that we can recruit, develop, and create an infrastructure for the Met for the long term.
Good. And one of the long-term issues you've been grappling with is your IT systems. And I think we've heard on many occasions about the number of different, often obsolete systems you're still having to maintain to ensure that you have a robustness in the data you hold. But how on track are you with reforming this? I know you've started the delivery programme of Connect. Can we be positive about this in future?
So I think we are very positive. I think we've had a very good couple of years with the team that lead on all of this, really, working incredibly well with the rest of the Met. So you'll know Angus, the digital lead, working with Robin and others. And that's why we've been able to be really confident about rolling out new kit that people need fast, which is effective, which is robust, which is very resilient. And we are excited about the sort of digital future. And throughout that, we've been making savings where we possibly can, and we've been absolutely, if you like, killing off old systems that we don't need, or bringing them into the modern age. And we have been reducing the sheer plethora that there have been. There is still further to go with this work, and you mentioned Connect. We have also, of course, a huge programme coming soon in replacing our command and control systems, which is, the lifeblood, really, for us. It isn't just us. Of course, it's also the Home Office-led systems like Police National Computer, the national databases, the airwave radio system. All these things are big systems which will need care and maintenance and, in due course, upgrading and replacement. But I am really confident about the ability of the people in the Met to make this happen, make it happen in a way which is good for the public in stewarding their money effectively, and good for the public in making the Met a truly modern police service. Probably might want to say something more about Connect and the databases.
So Connect is currently planned to go live in 2 major tranches in 2021. So we're working with the supplier Northgate on that. We've got some critical milestones coming up later this month, and then again in May, both of which will prove our confidence or not, but we're optimistic that it will prove our confidence. But as the Commissioner said, these will be hard bits of kit and technology to implement, but fundamentally changing the basis on which we can police and provide the kind of information to our officers in the future, both for their safety as well as for crime fighting purposes.
Thank you.
Okay, next section on private police forces, Sylvain Larber.
Well, firstly, Commissioner, I want to say we've been together for 20 years and it doesn't seem a day too long. And I'm sorry it's coming to an end.
Good luck to you, Tony. Thank
however, on private police forces, there has been an explosive growth in the number of these and the number of local authorities and local communities who are using them. Would you say there's a link between this growth and public dissatisfaction with policing?
Well, I'll start by saying there are a number of different organisations. I would make a distinction between those with which we have a formal relationship under the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme, and those companies such as you may have read about in the media recently, which offer essentially a private security service for people in a locality. We wouldn't call either of those private police forces, but let's not sort of fall out about that, Tony, at this late stage. The ones who are under the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme, as you know, perform a civil enforcement function, mostly on behalf of local councils, and they're like the council warden patrols of the past. Neither replace the core function of the police service. Contrary to what you say in explosion, we haven't seen a spike in the CSAS agreements during the period when police budgets were reduced. We've made more agreements latterly with event companies, as an example, which I think is a very positive thing, but we haven't seen an explosion. There is, of course, quite a bit of publicity about some of the private schemes, one in particular, and we haven't become aware that there is an increase in demand for such patrols because of reductions in police funding. But we don't have a formal relationship with those companies, and therefore I don't know how they go about, working out their market and creating a market and that kind of thing. But I think it has been throughout the time I've been policing the case that certain places, certain people, certain events have wanted to use extra security or private security of one sort or another. I don't see an explosion in it, but of course I'm always concerned if I think local people feel, less safe than they did.
Has the MPS ever purchased any services from the organisations that you say that you have a working relationship with, such as Park Force?
Gosh, I
Well, if
don't
you
know.
have
I mean, the ones we have a relationship with are local authorities, Transport for London,
Yes.
some event and traffic management companies, people who provide security on universities, some who provide security in shopping areas, the bids, so people who do security in the business improvement districts, but I'm not familiar with whether
I beg your pardon, I meant Park Guard. Does that ring a bell? I have a note which says that Park Guard provides services for you, and it has, and it alleges it's been given delegated powers from you, which allow them to issue fines and carry out searches. Not ring any bells?
So if they're CSAS, they may have delegated powers. That's not us purchasing a service. That's really that organisation or its parent organisation wanting the powers to do things in local areas.
Yes, well, I'm relieved to hear that, because I would have suggested a far better way of dealing with that, and I believe that this is down to you. I think it is you, since you became Commissioner, who scrapped the scheme whereby local authorities purchased police officers, and it's infinitely better, of course, that it should be MPS who are exercising policing powers rather than organisations like these. So the rider to that is, was it possibly a mistake for you to tell local authorities or to suggest to local authorities they shouldn't purchase policing?
We didn't.
I don't think we've not scrapped the scheme. We've changed the basis of it, as you know, and a number of those arrangements are still in place, and there's active conversations around at the moment. But it's certainly not the case that
I understand that one of my local authorities, which is the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames, claims that it tried to purchase officers and couldn't. Maybe that's worth investigating at a later date. Commissioner, in your initial answer, you say that these characters are not performing core functions. Well, I would suggest perhaps they are, because you, the MPS, are not prosecuting crimes which used to be prosecuted by the MPS, for example, shoplifting crimes, private prosecutions relating to offences which you're not investigating, and it may be that members of the public, and I'm now thinking probably of the organisations which you say are not properly aligned with policing, are able to succeed because they are going to be doing things which, if you like, the police have washed their hands of, such as small offences which these organisations are investigating and then prosecuting. Do you think that you've left that space, if you like, in the market?
So again, I think we need to be clear always about what we're talking about. But we have set out in our strategy to make the best possible use, mobilise partners and the public in preventing crime. And I'm, again, unashamed about saying that, yes, I have members of the public who volunteer with the police and in other ways to prevent crime in their open area. And also, and if you think of CST or Shomrim, you have more sorts of substantial schemes that work for a particular community, and that is great. Now, you could argue the work they're doing is work that might otherwise be done by the police on some occasions. Do I welcome the fact they do it? Absolutely I do. What they cannot do is take over our absolutely core functions. And they don't and they shouldn't. So it's mostly the ones in the CSAS. It gives them powers to deal with antisocial behaviour in some respects, requiring names and addresses, just in the way, very similar to the way you and I might remember the park warden keeping some order, requiring under 18s to surrender alcohol, dealing with beggars in an effective way. And they often work very closely, these CSAS schemes work extremely closely with the local police, and I see it as a positive thing. We cannot be everywhere doing everything for all people, and if there are other people who can also help, then I'm really grateful. But I reject the idea that we have, suddenly and substantially withdrawn from what ought to be seen as our work. I just don't see it that way, Tony.
Well, there's no question of any criticism about your determination to see that proper crime is dealt with. But nevertheless, it is really rather difficult for organisations, for example, retail organisations, who had been accustomed for crimes such as shoplifting to be prosecuted via the police, and they're having to go elsewhere. I very much hope that the government's funding, which I hope will be continuous funding and you won't be constantly from hand to mouth, will mean that we need these sorts of organisations less. In the interim, I'm glad to hear that you're working with these organisations.
Do, and also, of course, we work with the huge private security industry, whether that's on counter-terrorism and securing sites and events, whether it is fraud investigation in big firms, that we have to have productive, cooperative relationships with all kinds of people who are involved in security in one way or another, and they're a very big part of what keeps this city safe. We've talked to the retailers all the time, and I'm fully aware that the retail sector up and down the country has felt that in the recent years, for reasons that I think we all understand and have discussed here before, that they have been suffering from more antisocial behaviour in their shops, sometimes more violence being offered to staff. More of them have had to put private security on if they can afford to do so. This isn't, of course, the way I would like the world to be, and I am determined that although we won't be reversing some of the changes that we've had to make, that if somebody is violent, or if they are a repeat offender in a particular store, or if they are steaming or anything like that, we should be responding to that and responding to it effectively. And there's a job there for the neighbourhood officers to problem solve, and a job there for response and investigators to support the retail sector where we possibly can.
Thank you for that, Chairman.
Just changing the order of the agenda, so I think financial fraud, I will take it at a meeting in March, because it's too important issue to just rush through, given the significant rise in reported fraud. So can we have some questions on Operation Midland, Assemblymember Hall?
Deputy Commissioner, can you explain why you referred the complaint regarding the Commissioner and her actions on Operation Midland to the IOPC?
So the decision to refer the complaint to the IOPC was taken as a delegated function. It is nothing that I have any influence over. It is a process that was undertaken by the Chief Executive of MOPAC. And it's part of the process when you receive a complaint. It has been sent to the IOPC to see. It's not any judgment on whether the complaint has validity or not. It's for the IOPC to assess it.
Okay, what is the normal criteria for a referral?
Well, I can write to you and set out the criteria. We have it all on our website in terms of the criteria. It is just be really clear. It is a delegated function that is not one for myself or the Mayor.
Okay. Commissioner, can you comment on your referral?
I don't think that's appropriate. I'm afraid I can't, no. I don't think it's helpful for me to say anything. There is a process that is being properly undertaken when somebody complains. There's an assessment going on at the IOPC. This is not the moment for me to comment at all.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, just after Christmas, you said in an interview on Radio 4 that you understood why some people want heads to roll over the Operation Midland scandal. And when you look at the people that were involved in it and where they've gone on to and that sort of thing, do you not think it's a case that it, aided by the terrible inquiry by the IOPC, senior officers involved in the Midland scandal appear to be closing ranks and hoping that this scandal will go away?
So I said that I understand that some people are very angry, and I can't put myself in their shoes, of course, but I understand that they are, and that some people would like to see heads roll. What I can say is that there has been, Sir Richard's review, which no doubt we'll come to, there has been an IOPC investigation that has made some recommendations. There has been due process followed. No doubt there will be due process followed in relation to the complaint latterly received in relation to me, and that is all appropriate and proper. My job is to ensure that we have responded really effectively to Sir Richard's recommendations and to those that the IOPC make and have made, and indeed to respond should the HMI see FRS, when they report to the Home Secretary, and no doubt that will be public, on any further recommendations that they may make. And I think in terms of sort of detailed comment, probably once the HMI report has come out might be the best time for further detailed comment.
Okay, well, we'll look at it then. Why did the Met initially fight Harvey Proctor's damages claim, thereby running up huge legal bills before settling in November?
I am not at all the person to comment on the details of that. As you know, there was a legal claim. It is now settled. We have an agreement that we're not going to talk about the claim or the various phases that it went through.
Okay, that's fine.
Final set of questions on Extinction Rebellion. And again, over to you.
We decided to leave that favourite subject matter or not. You may be aware.
We're fucking finished.
Sorry. You may be aware that LBC's Nick Ferrari has got a campaign running this week demanding that the police have more powers to deal with Extinction Rebellion protests. I thoroughly approve of, as you would know. What specifically do you want from the government?
So ever since the first large-scale Extinction Rebellion protest in April last year, I have been talking publicly and indeed with the government about the potential for changes to powers and legislation that would enable the police to deal better with protests, perhaps in general, given that the Act that we work to, the Public Order Act primarily, is now very old, 1986, but specifically to be able to deal with protests where people are not primarily violent or seriously disorderly, but, as in this instance, had an avowed intent to, if you like, bring policing to its knees and the city to a halt, and were prepared to use the methods we all know they did to do that. So we have we put in a number of different suggestions, and we've been working with officials. The first, I'll talk about three important areas. I think the first is, as I've said, we think the Public Order Act needs a review, and in particular in relation to sections 12 and 14 to ensure consistency. It was obviously, problematic that the tactic, which is to get large numbers of people arrested, thereby to tangle up the Met's limited capacity, should be able to, from their point of view, work as well as it did, if you like. And we think that if there were some changes made, particularly to section 14, that would help considerably in the policing of assemblies like this. Secondly, we have suggested that perhaps the threshold before conditions can be imposed within the Act could be reduced. There is a phrase which is we need to be able to prove serious disorder or be satisfied there's serious disorder, damage to property or serious disruption to the life of the community. That's not further defined, but it seems, in law a high threshold, and we think that could come down. Obviously, we need to balance people's rights, those who wish to protest reasonably and those who wish to go about their business, and we completely want to do that and understand that's required. And then finally, we've been talking about whether public nuisance should be a statutory offence. So those are the three headlines. There are some other areas we've been talking to the government about, but those are our three most significant ones.
Well, very many of us support you, as you know, but more importantly, have the Home Office been broadly supportive of changing the law in this respect?
We've been having some very productive conversations with Home Office officials, yes we have, and of course it's not just us, but the National Police Chiefs Council lead on public order legislation, on public order, has been assisting us with this. And we're very hopeful that we may be able to get some changes.
I hope so. You certainly got support from Watercam.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Has been solved. Chair, just to put a balanced view on record here, I totally support the legal actions of Extinction Rebellion. I've been on their marches. I've seen them bring people together to campaign about the most critical issue that we're facing, and that is the climate emergency. And unlike my colleague over there, I don't really want them arrested and the keys tossed away. Just want to put that on record. Thank you.
I think the point is if there's active criminality, but I'll keep out. I'll let you two talk about
Why
it.
don't you keep out of it?
No, right, okay.
Just make the point, obviously we're talking about when it's illegal, which a lot of the things that were going on were, and supporting the police in order to keep the law upheld. We absolutely support 100%. I hope the government will assist.
And I love the last word of this, that's it. Right. So before we sort of move to the other part of the business, can I just come back to you, Deputy Mayor? And you don't have to come back to me, but when I said earlier that the Mayor had said this was about footage from body-worn video cameras, that whilst community groups are not allowed to view the footage, the review process was undertaken by the Deputy Mayor's team. I'm informed that this was his response from his office to a written question from Assembly Member Dismore. So presumably you're not aware of this, which is understandable, but clearly there's some lack of communication. So I'll get my office to send you a copy of the response, and if you can come back to us. So just to finish off the other business that we have, so can I thank our guests for attending today, for the answers to our questions, and can I also ask the committee to note the report, the discussion, and the report from MOPAC attached as Appendix 1 to the report? Noted. Thank you. Police and Crime Committee work program. Can I ask the committee to note the progress on our work program as set as report? Noted. Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 12th of February 2020 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. And as I have no other business, I close this meeting.
Ramesh, can I just say one thing?
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA Chamber